So first and foremost, forgive me if the video quality is a little off, or the lighting is messed up, or the audio is not the best. This is my first attempt at making a YouTube video. It's very unsettling. It's a lot of work, more work than I thought it would be. So please have patience. So, the 9 most disturbing books I have read. I've been thinking about this list a lot. I don't know why. I just wanted to sort of run through the things I've read that really rattled me, impacted me, traumatized me, some things that I enjoyed for that reason, others that I would never read again. Um, it just felt like a cool list to make, and sort of, in a way, restate the true power that literature has in unsettling or messing with our minds, because I think that a lot of people tend to think a book's just a book. It's not that potent or interesting. I've been seeing that being the sort of consensus with a lot of my friends or people that I know. So I just want to let you know, I don't consider myself easily rattled. In fact, I love horror. Horror is my favorite genre. But you'll find most of the books on this list aren't actually from that genre. And even though you'll see that I don't consider myself to be easily scared or put off, these books are a testament that that can definitely, most certainly happen. So I'm going down the list in no particular order except alphabetically, going by the author's last names, except for the last book I'm going to talk about, which is actually, I would say, the most disturbing book I've ever read, and actually the only book that I've ever actually had to just put down and stop reading, because that's just how much it was disturbing me. We'll talk about that more when I get to it. So, going by alphabetical order, the first book I'm going to talk about is Story of the Eye by Georges Bataille, originally published in 1928 in France as L'Histoire de l'Oeil. Please forgive my pronunciation. This is a novel that is often considered, well, it's often debated what it actually is trying to do. Georges Bataille himself was a philosopher. He was very much interested in taboo and disturbing subjects. And as you could probably guess, back in 1928, this wasn't exactly a normal or accepted outlook on life. He was interested in everything from sexual transgression to human sacrifice to ultra violence, you name it. And this book is a sort of testament to his unending interest for all things bizarre and unthinkable. Like I said, it's a lot of debate on what this book actually is. When it was first published, I think the consensus was that it was just pure erotica, that it was written for sexual pleasure. I honestly don't understand why anybody would think that, because if you read it, well, you'll see what I'm talking about. But then I think more recently it's being reevaluated, and I think perhaps even Bataille himself considered it a sort of psychoanalytic study on the human perversion, how it escalates. And I think it is a very interesting book because of that. And I do think that it is worth a read if you are into that kind of exploration of the human psyche. So the story follows an unnamed narrator and his partner, Simone. We don't actually fully understand, or it's not fully explained to us what their relationship is, other than one of escalating violence and sexual acts. It follows their sort of descent into madness, for lack of a better word. They start off fairly normal. They have some weird sexual practices between each other. You sort of think that it's just a kind of lover's affair. But then as more time passes and more liquids and round objects and other people get involved into their journey, you start to really see how far they will go. And in fact, it culminates in murder in a very interesting way. I think this book is quite interesting. I mean, as you can see, it's pretty short. You could probably read it in one sitting. But I just thought, the exploration of taboo that you find in this book, especially for 1928, is very interesting, very reminiscent of the earlier works of course, the Marquis de Sade, also a French author. And I think that if you are interested in that kind of, long 19th century, expansion into works that challenged censorship and challenged social taste, you'll really find that this is an interesting one to explore. I wouldn't recommend it to a more casual reader, but I wouldn't recommend any of the books on this list to those kinds of readers. But yeah, this is definitely one that has a lot of messed up stuff going on in it, and check it out if you want. So the next book I'm going to talk about is a crime detective novel from 1999, published in Britain. It is Birdman by Mo Hayder. I had actually read another work of Mo Hayder, which is the Devil of Nanking, which I think is a really phenomenal book, and it's also very sort of violent and bizarre. But I think that this one is actually a really good work of literature that I would recommend to anybody that's into the sort of crime and detective genre. But out of the two, if I had to pick most disturbing, it would definitely go to Birdman. So Birdman follows Detective Caffrey, who is actually part of a series of detective novels that Mo Hayder has written. And in this particular book, Caffrey is investigating the murders of 5 sex workers in the outskirts of London, and he's basically trying to catch the killer responsible for their murders. This book goes into extreme detail in explaining to you the modus operandi of the perpetrator, and the way that he stalks, murders his victims, and then ultimately the way that he defaces their bodies, which is where the title of Birdman comes from. It's something that was very haunting. I remember I was actually quite unsettled while I was reading this, and I thought the prose is actually pretty brilliant. It's written very straightforward. It's not too complicated to follow. There are sort of like strands of character journeys that ultimately connect, but it is one of those books that has you jumping around from character to character. That's not a bad thing, of course, but it's just something to keep in mind depending on what your taste of reading is. Interestingly enough, I read this actually in a college class. The same for The Devil of Nanking. I read this for a detective fiction class that I took in college. And I remember this being assigned reading, and so many students sort of complaining and being outraged at the fact that they were being forced to read this, because once you really get into it, you start to see how horrible it gets. So I think for that reason, it was a really kind of interesting experience reading it, because I was reading it alongside other college students who were just disturbed and pissed off. It was fun. But I think that it is a really I don't know if I should say entertaining, but you do kind of get through it pretty quickly, because like with any detective novel, you get engrossed in the mystery and you want to find out who did the crime and for what reason. In answering those questions, I do think that it's a pretty satisfactory book, so you'll definitely enjoy it, but just be warned that it is very violent, very graphic, and a lot of the imagery that the author conveys in it will stay with you for a while. But I do think that Mo Hayder is a really good author, and I do think that this is one of her best works. So I think if you go through all of the lists that have been made on the internet for most disturbing books, you'll probably find all of these included in at least one of those lists. But this next one I'm going to talk about is actually one that I don't think many people would consider disturbing, at least not in the same way as the other ones that I have on here. But I did, read it, and I did find it to be quite unsettling. This is Against Nature by Joris-Karl Huysmans, another French author. This one was actually published in the 1800s, late 1800s. I don't have the year. My apologies, but it is somewhere around 1880s. This is, some would even tell you that it might be a stretch to call it a novel. Basically, this was part of a short-lived literary and artistic movement of the late 1800s, which was called the Decadent movement. The movement basically entailed an overall excess of man-made, things, and a overall disgust and sickness over the human experience, a very sort of nihilistic, cynical, and anti-materialist movement, of which this novel is considered basically the culmination of that movement, and the staple work of art for that movement. Like I said, it's kind of hard to describe it as you would any other novel. It more like reads like a catalog of different things. The book basically follows Enceinte. I'm not even sure that's how you pronounce it. Des Enceinte. He is a French aristocrat descended from a noble family, and of course he is very wealthy. And the vast majority of the book revolves around him cataloging, talking about all the things that he owns or has seen, and talking smack about the things that he considers to be below him or not as tasteful as what is in his possession. And I know it sounds weird, but that's because this is a really weird book. He goes over things like jewelry, precious works of art that he has, the various perfumes that he owns, the places that he's traveled to, the weird foods that he eats. It just eventually becomes a little overwhelming in terms of that. And if you've heard about this book before, then one of the most infamous scenes in it is when he describes owning a turtle that he encrusted its shell with precious jewels. Eventually the turtle was unable to move because of the weight of the jewels that were encrusted on its back, and it dies. And that's a thing that happens. I think particularly disturbing to me, because I think this is such a almost visionary, like a psychic prediction of the state of things that we see today. It very much reads like somebody's Instagram feed, if you want to look at it that way. It's all about like cataloging possessions. It's about showing off. It's about the effect on the human psyche when your only aspiration or your only method of personality or existence revolves around the things that you own and the things that you want to show off to other people. I think that ultimately we are meant to be disgusted by the life that Des Enceinte lives. One of the most particularly telling passages in this book, and that I can relate to the experience that I've had on people like influencers, or people that flex on Instagram, is he goes to an English cafe that he frequents. That's where he mostly goes to eat lunch, and he says that he's pleased by the crowd that's at the restaurant, because they all resemble the images that he had in his mind when he was reading a novel by Charles Dickens. I just feel like the artifice of the human experience that Huysmans presents in his book is very much relevant, much more relevant than ever in our current state of things. I do feel that this is a worthy novel if you want to sort of explore the the origins of human consumption and human materialism. It is a really weird novel, I assure you, and it disturbed me particularly because I thought that it was very visionary in what would ultimately become the human experience in the 21st century. I'm not trying to sound like I'm above any of this. I have Instagram. I post there constantly, but still, it's a good thing to reflect on. It's a good thing to sort of keep in your mind that um, the human experience that was a century ago might not be that different from what we are going through today. So again, I don't think this one is disturbing in the same way that the other ones are, but it's still very unsettling and of course really really weird, and I think most people that read it will agree that it's a very weird book. So the next book I'm going to talk about is one that I do think most disturbing book lists probably mention, and deservedly so. It's The Girl Next Door by Jack Ketchum. I actually really like Jack Ketchum's writing. I think that he's a brilliant author. Sadly, he passed away recently, but his work, I think, should be immortalized in the pantheon of horror writers of America, and deservedly so. This book was actually adapted into a horror film, which, if you've seen, um, you probably know what I'm about to talk about with this. This story is, I like to describe it as um, the human debauchery and savagery, uh, that you find in a work like The Lord of the Flies, but it's transplanted and blown up by 1,000 times into American suburbia. The story follows this aunt who, uh, I believe the family in question, they're called the Chandlers. It follows this aunt who comes into the care of her two nieces, Meg and Susan, and they at first seem like a normal, typical American family. She has three other sons that she takes care of along with the two nieces, but you can sort of tell from the beginning that there's something wrong with this aunt. That she gives a little too much freedom to her kids and the friends of her kids, and eventually this weird disposition devolves into just torture and brutalization of her two nieces at the hands of her children, but of course with her enabling them. You see everything from physical and sexual assault, psychological torture. It's horrible to read through the things that the two girls go through. And all the more horrible, I think, in that Jack Ketchum really sort of speaks to a human experience that's not out there or completely out of the realm of possibility. I think that the reason why his writing is so potent is because it feels very real when you read it. Eventually, it follows the main character, the narrator of the story, trying to save the two girls, but you kind of, as you read through it, think, is it too late already? Can they be saved after all that they've gone through? It's a very harrowing story, and of course, it's very disgusting, I would say, to read through it. I really did feel my stomach drop a couple of times as I was reading this, because um, it's written so with such a sober, like, matter of fact tone that um, I just can't shake some of the things that I read about in here, and it's very very powerful work. And I think that all of Jack Ketchum's work is very written in a similar manner, and it's very potent. And I just wanted to say that if you do end up picking this up and it sounds interesting to you and you want to read it, I just want to say, do yourself a favor and also pick up Peaceable Kingdom by the same author. This is the collection of some of his best short stories. I would say that, usually, I don't know if I'm the only one, but when I pick up a short story collection, it's because I've heard of one or two of the stories that are in it, and I just kind of end up reading those. and hardly ever really go through the entire collection. This is one of the few short story collections that I actually read from cover to cover. I think that all of it is really good, and Jack Ketchum's style of writing is, I really enjoy it. And if you want any recommendations of the stories that are on here, definitely read Gone and Megan's Law. Those are particularly powerful. And of course, I think his most famous short story, The Box, is also in here. If you haven't heard of it or you haven't read it, check it out. It's really good. So yeah, Jack Ketchum, great author, but reader beware. It is very, very, very powerful stuff. So the next book I'm going to talk about is actually considered one of the greatest books in American history, and it's lauded as one of the great American novels. And I'm talking about Blood Meridian by Cormac McCarthy. It's often described as an anti-Western because it takes place, like the West with the whole cowboys and Indians battle, but the way that it is written, the way that it approaches its subject matter is truly compelling and out of the ordinary for other books that deal with similar topics. I think particularly I connected with this book in some way because the action does take us through places like Yuma Crossing, which is so close to my hometown, and then the action takes us even all the way up to San Diego, California. So it sort of encompasses my entire home region, and that's why I found it really interesting. So the story follows this main character who's only called the Kid as he participates in the endeavors of this scalp hunter gang back in the late 1800s in the Wild West. The violence that is sort of described throughout, brutalization of everything from Mexican villages to, of course, natives and particularly children. Sometimes it becomes too much. I mean, this is one of the few books that I actually felt it was making me physically sick just reading through it. It's very powerful stuff, and of course, Cormac McCarthy is a genius when it comes to prose. His prose tends to jump around from very different styles, from being sort of very literary, almost poetic and reflective and philosophical, and then he just jumps into this very sort of plain and subdued paragraph about scalping and murdering and sexual violence, you name it. Of course, he's mostly known for having authored his two most recent novels, which are No Country for Old Men and The Road. But he's been writing all the way back to the 1960s. This novel was published in 1985, I believe, which is back then I don't think it garnered as much attention as it has in recent years. And I think deservedly so. This is considered one of the great American novels, like I said before, and it's very powerful stuff. I don't want to spoil too much of it because I do think that you need to read this. I do think that the subject matter it deals with is an episode of American history that is often either romanticized or just brushed off altogether. But Cormac McCarthy pulls absolutely zero punches. This is a great book. I read it a while ago, but this is one of the ones that I would actually really like to pick up and reread because I do remember it being very powerful and unforgettable in a lot of ways. Yeah, so I think if you're new to Cormac McCarthy's work, I would say try to go through The Road, which is of course one of his most appraised works. And if you like what you see, I would definitely recommend that you go into his older stuff because it is equally good, if not more. Up next, I have Piercing by Ryu Murakami, the only Japanese entry into this list. I actually became exposed to Ryu Murakami because if you're familiar with his name, of course, you know that he authored the novel Audition, which was adapted in 1999 into a horror film by Takashi Miike. And of course, that film is known as one of the greatest, most disturbing horror films ever made. I actually don't really think it's that disturbing. The violence in it is not as graphic as other things I have seen, but I do think that it is a great, phenomenal film. And so I was curious to explore the novel that it was based on, and it eventually led me to exploring Murakami's other work, and in particular, this one I think really sort of stuck with me. This was published in 1994 in Japan. So the novel follows this character, Kawashima, who is this normal, uninteresting guy by all means, except for one little detail in that every night, you know, he goes into his newborn's crib and stares over it, holding an ice pick in his hand, and he has to fight back the urge to stab his baby to death. So what he decides ultimately is that he is going to instead hire a sex worker and take out his urge on her and basically murder her instead of his kid. So this is the sort of violence and the action that the book sets you up with, but eventually you start to discover more about the character's life, and I actually really like how the relationship between victimizer and victimized in this book is sort of represented and twisted around every which way. Eventually, you know, it's kind of one of those books, kind of reminds me of Hard Candy, if you've ever seen that movie, where you know, you understand the circumstances, you understand who the bad guy is, but you start to sort of feel uneasy because you start to sympathize you know, with the bad guy, and then you start to hate him again, and then you start to sympathize with the victim. Eventually you get pissed at the victim too. It's one of those books that sort of twists your head all around and plays with conventions and expectations of its audience. I think, I don't know if this is just the case with the translated work and the work that the translators do when sort of presenting Japanese novels to American audiences. But I have read, of course, the other works by Ryu Murakami, and I have read works like Now You're One of Us by Asa Nonami, Parasite Eve, and I've sort of noticed that, at least speaking for the translations, they're written in a very sort of straightforward manner. There's not a lot of like florid prose, as you would say. That doesn't mean that it's badly written. I don't think, in fact, I think it's a style that I very much enjoy, because it can be quite effective in representing things like violence, which are usually used to authors trying to ham up or throwing your face with all this vitality and shock. But I think I am 1,000 times more disturbed by authors sort of casually and soberly speaking of all these atrocious, terrible things. So I don't know if it's just a style that's typical of Japanese writing, or if it's something that gets lost in translation. But I mean, I don't necessarily think of it as a bad thing. In fact, I think it helps add a lot to the prose. So I really enjoy this book. Again, violence, as with all the other books I'm talking about, violence, disturbing subject matter. In fact, the violence in this book, I don't think I was as disturbed by as other things that are mentioned, especially when we start to unravel the pasts of the characters that we are introduced to. Definitely one that stays with you long after you read it. And of course, I wanted to say that if you enjoy piercing, you should definitely try and check out Murakami's other work. Of course, as I talked about, his novel Auditions, pretty short, but if you've seen the film, I would still recommend that you check out the novel because it's quite good. And I would also recommend that you check out his other works, like In the Miso Soup, and I've also read his novel Coin Locker Babies, which is a weird one. But I do recommend that you explore his work because most of it has been translated and is easily available here in the West, and I do think that he is an author to look out for. So up next, I want to talk about one of the strangest books I've actually ever read. It is quite bizarre and surreal, and ultimately, when I read it, I didn't know what to make of it. And it was just, it was one of those "what the fuck did I just read" situations. This is Cows by Matthew Stokoe. I think this is, first and foremost, I want to say a book that I read when I was way too young to be reading it. I think I read it when I was like 14 or 15. Um, so the book is, it's published in 1998, I want to say, or it might even have been um, before that. Um, 1997. So it was by Matthew Stokoe. It's a British novel. It actually reminds me a lot of another book um, called Omnivores by Lydia Millet. I own that book, but I don't have it on me because I lent it to a friend and she's been reading it for like 7 years. But it reminded me a lot of it because it's one of those stories. If you're familiar with Omnivores, of course you know it's grounded in reality. Nothing in it is sort of magical or out of the realm of possibility, but still it creates a very sort of surreal and quite unbelievable circumstance because of all the, you know, bizarre little quirks that people partake in, and the weird social and world views that they share. This is one of those books. It's not fantasy or science fiction or anything of the sort, but it definitely lends itself to the realm of the uncanny or unbelievable. Uh, it follows the story of this guy named Stephen who lives with his mother in this sort of decrepit home, and she force feeds him all kinds of gross stuff that he believes she's trying to slowly poison him until he dies. And he spends most of his time working at a slaughterhouse and watching TV and watching all these idealized portrayals of life and family on TV. And eventually it sort of gets into his head, and he gets this notion that he wants to marry this girl that he meets, but to do that he is going to have to kill his mom. So the journey eventually takes off with that idea that he is going to commit matricide, but as to where the cows play in and what they do and what they represent and etc. I do think that you're gonna have to read it if you want to find out. I don't want to spoil anything, but I'll just let you know right off the bat. You know, violent acts, bizarre sexual acts, bestiality, self-harming, uh, man and animal orgies, you name it, it's all in here. So reader beware, like I've been saying this whole time. But this is actually, I think, ultimately, and I don't know if other people that have read it share the same view, but I think this is a really, really funny book. The humor in it is not, it's one of those things where it doesn't feel purposeful, but I do believe that the author meant for it to be humorous, and you have to kind of have a darker sense of humor to appreciate that. But I don't think, I do think that all of us have a dark humor, whether we want to admit it to ourselves or not. It is a very weird book, but because it has such a, you know, humorous, absurd, unbelievable situations, I think it is kind of an enjoyable read. I had fun reading it, I remember, but also some of the things that happen in here are not meant for everybody to read, and definitely would keep out of the reach of children. But if you're interested in that kind of stuff, you know, it's pretty short, it's pretty easy read, and ultimately it sticks with you. I do recommend it for that reason, but I recommend it, as you know, only to a particular kind of reader, not for everybody, definitely. All right, so I've gone through 7 books, like I said, in alphabetical order by the author's last name. I have 2 more books to go, and I just want to say that these last 2 are kind of in the why did I read this pile, and definitely 2 that I am kind of dubious in recommending to anybody. Like I myself don't know why I subjected myself through it, but I am putting them in this list because I think they deal with subject matter that is important to read about. So the penultimate book I'm going to talk about is The Room by Hubert Selby Jr. Now, as some of you might know, Hubert Selby Jr. is actually mostly known for having authored this book called Requiem for a Dream, which was adapted into a film by Darren Aronofsky, and it's actually considered to be a very good film. And I personally thought it was really well done. But knowing about that film and ultimately that it was adapted from a book led me to want to explore his writing. I've actually read another one of his books, which is The Demon, and I think they are both very unsettling novels. But I would say from the two, The Room is definitely the one that made me scream "What the fuck" the loudest. The story, it's not like kind of like with Against Nature. I can't really say that it's a straightforward plot progression kind of novel. It's a series of recollections, fantasies, dreams, and even police interrogations and court cross examinations revolving around the unnamed narrator who finds himself incarcerated, and he spends the entirety of his time recalling the crimes that he committed, fantasizing about brutalizing the people that got him in the position that he is, brutalizing women. It's very horrific stuff. I think when I was reading it, there were some passages that just kind of made me go, "Wow!" Like that. It certainly takes a lot of guts for an author to really go into it with such frankness and without pulling the punches at all. I think Hubert Selby Jr. is particularly known for being that kind of author. And if you've heard of this book, of course you know the detail that Selby Jr. himself has said that he was unable to read the book after he wrote it, like 20 years after he wrote it. And I can't say that I've ever heard of an author ever admitting that. I've heard of authors like admonishing their earlier work for not being too good and refusing to read it for that reason. But I had never heard of an author refusing to read his work because it was too disturbing to him. So that's definitely interesting. And I do think that if any novel would warrant that kind of response from even its own author, it would be this one. There's a particular upsetting passage of two guys who hire a sex worker under the pretenses that they're just asking for her services, but ultimately they end up raping her and brutalizing her body, and it's just sick, deranged stuff. But I do think that the reason I want to include it and the reason that I'm not totally bashing it is because I do think that it explores a segment of the human condition that is definitely worthy of us to acknowledge that it exists and that it is out there, that none of the things that are written in this book are things that are completely out of the realm of possibility, that this is the life that a lot of people lead. And of course, in current times, in our current climate, I think it is important to understand and to acknowledge how some things work, like criminalization, incarceration, what violent crime entails and where it is born and where it leads people into. Hubert Selby Jr., I don't have anything bad to say about him, except I want to praise him for actually having the guts to write something as visceral and unattractive as this, because I do think that more authors need to bring to attention the kind of very upsetting but very real things that go on in this novel. I'm not of the mind that fiction can corrupt people. I don't think there's such a thing as a book or a film or a video game that's gonna make someone go out there and do horrible things. And I think that if it does, you already have to have something wrong with you that the medicine or therapy should have taken care of before we go and bash a book or a work of fiction for being the perpetrator. But that being said, I do think that when you consume something like this book, you have to do it with a mind of, self-analysis and, of course, an understanding of society and the way that it works and why it leads certain people to act certain ways. But in a list of most disturbing books that I've ever read, of course, I think I had to include this one. And so, with those 8 books out of the way, I think it's time to talk about, like I said in the beginning, the most disturbing book that I ever attempted to read. This is the book that was so unsettling and disgusting to me that I just had to put it down, and I have never gone back to it, and I don't think I plan on doing it. This is 2013's Tampa by Alissa Nutting. This book is, it's something. Basically, we're following the life of Celeste Prince, who is a newly licensed teacher out in Tampa, Florida, who is about to start her first year of teaching in middle school. And that's all great and nice, except for the fact that her plans for her first year of teaching include seducing and ultimately raping one of her male students. I think, I've heard it described as a reverse Lolita, and I think that's an appropriate description for it. This book was just so twisted in the way that it presented the psyche of the main character. I think Alissa Nutting is such a brilliant and ballsy author for even daring to conceive something like this. I think particularly the initial passages where she's describing how she's preparing her classroom for the arrival of her students, which includes things like masturbation and fantasy and sort of scouting out all the students around her to pick the best one, and it's just really, really twisted stuff. And I think, like I was talking about with The Room, because most of the stories that I have covered here in this list usually pertain to male perpetrators of sexual or physical violence, which is of course a very pressing issue in our society that is very real. But I think Tampa sort of reminds us that that kind of abuse, especially child abuse, can take on all kinds of forms, and people, regardless of gender or sexuality, can take on the role of abuser or abused. And I think that for that, I really want to congratulate Alissa Nutting on writing something like this. That being said, I got up to about halfway through it, which is when the abuse starts, when she finally, gets her hands on her student and is about to sexually abuse him. And that's where I just kind of shut it off. And I thought, I know what's coming, and I know it's not good, and I get it. I don't want to keep going through it, but I think I'm not gonna, like with The Room, I'm not gonna bash this book or say that it's obscene or anything like that. I don't believe in censorship. I don't believe in charges of obscenity or anything like that. But I just thought this book is really sort of triggering and not for me, and I don't want to keep going through it. But I do think, like I said, it's an important book for it to exist and for it to remind us of the shapes and roles that abuse takes in our society. It's very twisted. And of course, I read that Harmony Korine, if you're familiar with him, you know what he's about. He's working on a film adaptation of this book, which of course he is. But it was such a disturbing book. I don't know. I tried to read it and I just couldn't. I was so thrown off. I just didn't know it was gonna go there, and it's something. You might not agree with me in the disturbingness of these books, or even this one if you've read it, but just talking from personal experience, I would say this is the most unsettling book that I have ever laid eyes on. So there's my list, and of course it's my list, my opinions, my experiences. When you try to describe the best books, the most disturbing books, the scariest books, it's all subjective, of course. It's all a matter of opinion. You might not necessarily agree with my picks, but if you're watching this, if you watch all the way through and you have any suggestions of disturbing or weird, bizarre books, let me know. I want to know about them. I'm always sort of looking out for more transgressive reading. I do think that it is an interesting section of literature that people often shy away from talking about. But I think some of the greatest books that I've ever written, some of the greatest stories that have ever been told are those of transgression, and are those that unsettle us and make us question things and make us uneasy about certain things. And I do think that it's important to keep writing and reading those kinds of books. So yeah, thank you if you stuck all the way through, and hopefully this becomes a thing that I keep doing. There's a lot of books that I want to talk about. Yeah, so bye.